Well, hello and welcome. Matthew Grant here, and we are reaching the end of August, but judging by the empty streets and trains here in London, I think many of you are still off on a beach somewhere. Well, we're on a roll with some brilliant podcast guests now, and this week is no exception. Now, you've almost certainly heard of Guidewire, now a $12 billion company. And if you are following investment in early stage companies in the UK, you will have seen the $73 million investment in Exponential at the start of this year by Battery Ventures. But have you ever wondered, how do you build a company the size of Guidewire, and who's writing such large checks for investment, and how do you attract their attention? And when things get really tough, how do you push through and keep going? Well, you're about to find out. I was really honored to have a time to speak to Marcus Ryu. He's lived such a full life, and this really is only a taster for all his great advice. But I'm going to guarantee you're going to get at least one thing to take away from this, and it really could change your life or your money back. Well, finally, as much as Rob and I love doing these podcasts, we can only do it because of the support from all our corporate members and sponsors. Now, if you too want to share your story of the world and become part of our community of the curious, then please do contact us to find out how you can benefit from membership. hello@insuretech.co. Marcus, it's a real pleasure to talk to you. I enjoy talking to all my guests, but you've got a special place because in my days at RMS, we used to look at Guidewire as a comparable when you went public. And we were always watching what you're doing. And of course, we know Guidewire, and you're a good friend of ours, a supporter. And you've also got some really great insights into founding a business. So thank you very much. I know you're incredibly busy. I just really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Matthew. Honored to be here.
And my reference for this, and I'm going to recommend it to everybody because we're not going to cover everything, is the Logan Bartlett podcast you did. And I know there'll be a long time before I interview someone who was followed up by Sam Altman by their last podcast. So that is an excellent podcast. And what we don't cover in here definitely is going to be covered in there. But let me just give you a bit of background. So you founded Guidewire back in 2002. You were CEO from 2010 to 2019. You continue to be chairman today. And you also led the company through the IPO in 2012. Today, I think you're spending most of your time, which we'll talk a bit about, at Battery Ventures. And for others of us here in the UK, we're delighted to see that you made an investment in Exponential, UK-based $73 million, which will give us a good shot of enthusiasm at the start of the year with that. And we'll talk a bit about that. You also have a degree from Princeton, but we can also claim a little bit of you because you spent a couple of years at Oxford University doing some philosophy, I believe.
That's right. I was a co-founder, not the sole founder of Guidewire. It's very important to note that I had 5 co-founders that were instrumental to the company in those early years. And then my degree from New College, Oxford was a B.Phil in philosophy, a very demanding program. It's quite humbling.
So in terms of what we're going to cover today, I thought we'd look at 3-4 areas. So one is just your experience of building a business and the relevance of that for others today. The second one, the Guidewire experience, and how does that reflect on the state of the insurance world and where that's going? As you're looking at battery and looking at what's out there, what is most intriguing to you from insurance? And also specifically talk a little bit about what it was that led you to invest in Exponential. Does it sound like probably quite a lot to get through the next 45 minutes or so?
Fantastic.
You actually, at one point, I did consider a career in philosophy, but McKinsey scooped you up. And then at some point, you decided actually you want to go and start a business. You can talk a bit more about what drove you, but I'm intrigued. It seems like there are some people who are driven to be entrepreneurs, and that's just wired into them. And there are some people who are sort of accidental entrepreneurs, and that just presents itself. It was actually what drove you to decide you could go out in the world and take on all the challenges of starting a business and be successful.
Yeah, so Matthew, I think between those two archetypes, I was probably like squarely in the center. I was at a very academic background. I was certain I was going to be a professor. I was more at home in a university than anywhere else. I was better at school than anything else. And so I thought that would be natural. I was in part, though, a product of the times. I finished graduate school just at the beginning of the dot-com era. And it was a time of fevered excitement. And then, to my great surprise about myself, I decided I was put on this earth to be an entrepreneur, not a philosopher. When I have reflected back on that time, I realized there were certain personality traits of mine that I see similar, or I see represented in other entrepreneurs. And one of them was just a resistance to having a boss, a kind of unreasonable confidence in my own ideas, and just a belief, just a hunger to create not only a profit-making entity, but really more a kind of collective, an organization that would bear my imprint and that of the people who were like-minded. And I didn't think that those were the most important traits. I thought maybe that was just a product of the times. But as I've reflected more, perhaps I could have done no other.
And then in terms of deciding on insurance, because there's a certain kind of entrepreneur who's in a business, can't get stuff done. You just have a lot of those people. They decide to go off, no longer be an underwriter. They want to go and run a business or something like that, or build the product. But for you, you took a slightly different approach, didn't you? You were sort of aware of insurance, but you went deep in insurance when you decided that was where you would start building a business.
No, far from it. I often counsel entrepreneurs, if they're going to start a company, to focus on a domain that they already know. And many of the best companies come from people who want to solve a problem that they've endured, that they think needs to be solved, as opposed to those who come up with the idea in the shower and say, shouldn't one of these exist in the world? I'm actually one of the latter category. I did not know anything about the insurance industry, or what I knew was laughably small, and I was the most knowledgeable of the group of us as founders. However, we were informed by a kind of higher order idea, which is that we wanted to build enterprise software and that there was an enormous opportunity in vertical software. It's not, at the time, it was not really a venture investable category. The conventional wisdom is you had to invent, if you're going to do enterprise software, you had to build something like an ERP system or maybe a CRM system, which was just coming into existence at that time. But we had the theory that the most important problems to solve are specific to an industry. That was true then, it's even truer today. And that the largest software companies in the world, the Microsoft, SAP, et cetera, were not well equipped to really understand, patiently gather the requirements of a given industry and then go through the arduous and iterative process of building, core systems for them. And it was that initial conviction coupled with some early hints about the opportunity in property and casualty insurance that led us there. And then, some 20 years ensued of being deep in the salt mine, of learning everything there is to know about insurance. And, a few decades in, I can say I'm not quite as amateur, but I'm humbled on a daily basis about how much I still have to learn about I've devoted my career to serving.
Yeah, well, a lot more than most of us. And that point about vertical software, that seems to be even more important today than it was 20 years ago. You used to speak about that on Logan's podcast about you think that's indeed actually the future of software. I think he's actually literally said the future of software is vertical.
And I think many conventional software categories like CRM, maybe HCM, anything to do with sales, anything to do with distribution, obviously anything to do with pricing, all of these are going to be increasingly specialized, not just to an industry, but to sub-verticals thereof. I think that's an inevitability, and that's just the natural progress in technology.
And then you with your co-founders, you went out, you had a technique, which was you went to go and talk to insurance companies to basically feed back to them what you learned. You didn't try and go and sell something. Although I was interested if I got the maths right on this. It took you 18 months to get your first paying clients. I know you had one almost client that didn't then actually cancel.
Roughly.
Is that right?
That's correct.
Actually, yeah. 18. So actually, I just think that's congratulations, because the sales cycles for insurance is at 18 months. So that would suggest day one, someone said, we like what you've got. And then if it's the average sales cycle, it would have taken them 18 months to cut you the check.
Yeah, it felt like eternity at the time, but in hindsight, it was quite reasonable. The challenging part was it never got really much faster than that. And we used to talk about our sales cycles as having two phases. There was a chapter we called Wandering in the Desert, where you were just talking to parties who were interested, making an intellectual case, talking in the abstract, hoping that they would mobilize an institutional decision to do something, and then an actual serious sales cycle. The Wandering in the Desert phase could last anywhere from a few months to a decade. We had certainly examples of that, while the serious evaluation usually took somewhere between a year to a year and a half.
And I'm guessing, given your role as CEO, well, you weren't the CEO then, like the co-founder, and you had this vision, and actually elsewhere you've talking about that this concept you refer to as a startup as an insurgent, and three themes you mentioned are you see something is broken, a new entrant is required, and then this last bit, which I think is excellent, the sort of confessions need to be quite arrogant, which is I alone can fix it. So what was it when you and your colleagues did interviews that you saw and you specifically thought I can fix it? Because I think also what goes hand in hand in that is the confidence. Even if someone goes no or is slow, you go no. Eventually you'll get it. You will learn what I know, which is you need to fix this.
Indeed, you really need three conditions. You have to believe that there's a problem that's of sufficient interest that there could be a commercial opportunity there. Second, that it can't be solved by anyone who's already has credentials and assets, and that third, of the other people who could solve it, that you are the best equipped to succeed. And each of those should be thought of as a hurdle to get through. Though I think the vast majority of entrepreneurs blast through steps 2 and 3. They get convinced that there's a problem and therefore a company ought to exist, and that's often not the case. In our case, it didn't take long to recognize. In fact, every conversation validated that property and casualty insurers were deeply dissatisfied, with their IT incumbents. Could elaborate on that at great length, but it was almost a truism that there was disappointment and frustration, exasperation with either the internal IT assets that had been developed, or of the various vendors that had tried. So that became axiomatic, right from the beginning. Second, though, was a very difficult question. Is there room for a new entrant? Because there were certainly service providers, many consulting firms, for example, who said, we understand your domain, and if you want to build something specific to your industry or to your enterprise, you need us. You need someone like us to gather those requirements and build you a custom system because you are one in the world. We thought that was wrong. That software is very difficult to build. It's very expensive to build, very risky to build, and so there was room for a new entrant that delivered a sufficiently configurable, sufficiently standardized software platform as a product. But it was a very difficult question to say: are we the ones to do it, given our meager assets and credentials, our relative youth, etc.? Are we the ones to do it? And that was the hill, so to speak, that we nearly died on, trying to make that case. But when you're an entrepreneur, you can't ponder the third too deeply because, self-doubt can kill any ambition. Of course, we were riven with self-doubt, but, we just said, we're going to find a way. We pledge our honor to this, and we'll see it through, at least to the point when it would be just irrational to continue. Maybe we proceeded a bit beyond that, but we did answer those 3 questions over the years.
Yeah, and I can see this sort of enabling self-doubt, which is like worry. It's a kind of enabling self-doubt, which goes, you've got to prove yourself, and there's this disabling self-doubt, which means you just stop and freeze and can't do anything. And one is very powerful and one is very destructive.
You really have to be on a knife edge, between those 2 things, because if overconfidence, of course, is just as disastrous as crippling underconfidence.
And then a slightly sort of personal question for Robin and I. The average age when we started InsureTech was 56. I'll let people do the maths as to how we got to that. But what's your experience been of sort of people starting later in life, founding businesses versus with earlier on?
Yeah, it's a question quite personal to me because the classic Silicon Valley happy arc, I don't know how many people have actually experienced this, but at least archetypally or aspirationally, it's you work for a great company in the era back in the day that might have been, Hewlett Packard or IBM or something. Then you start another company, but you're poor, so you have to do it with lots of investor capital, and you make that successful. And then you have one more chapter in life where you get to do it on your own terms and start your own company. I don't know how many get to do that. I aspired to that, and I sometimes think about it still today. And there are characteristic challenges at each stage. I think to try later in life, you have enormous advantages in terms of experience, wisdom, sobriety, relationships, domain knowledge, etc. But sometimes you lose a kind of recklessness, which serves you well as a parent and then, as a tax-paying citizen, etc. But you need a certain kind of recklessness, I think, to start a company. It doesn't really make sense on a risk-adjusted basis. I've talked about the stats, or after studying them, they're not favorable. They're terrible, in fact. So you need to be able to set aside the kind of rational calculation that comes to us later in life and say, just heedlessly, we're going to make this work. It deserves to exist. I'm going to find fulfillment in the journey, even though it will be difficult. And come hell or high water, we're going to make it work. And that tends to be a characteristic more of the young than the more mature, but not necessarily. And again, you can find that magical combination where you bring the best of both.
And Marcus, you said you looked at the stats. Is that stats relating to companies that fail, or is that specifically companies that are started by people later in life that fail? Or
Oh, actually, no. Just broadly speaking, that your chance of succeeding as a venture-backed company or just as a new entrepreneur, and there's an enormous kind of survivor bias. We look at the successful examples, and then we kind of overdetermine the causality that got them there, not realizing many, many others that were started by equally or even more talented and more intelligent people who, for whatever random reason along the way, just suffered the slings of bad fortune and just didn't make it. And it's one of the dangers, actually, of very successful entrepreneurs is that they tend to overascribe to their own actions of their success and forget about all the randomness that helped them along the journey. Well, actually, there are 2 types of successful entrepreneurs: those that do that, which I see quite a bit, but also the other kind who are then, I think, just realizing, there, but for the grace of God, did this happen and work out? I worked very hard, but there were a million ways we could have died on the path. I think anyone who's gone through a very long and challenging journey comes to appreciate, with self-awareness, realizes how many other people were part of that success, how many things could have gone wrong, how many lucky breaks it took. And you can make some of your own luck, but certainly not all of it.
So just now, sort of rolling forward to Guidewire where you are today, and you've got 25% of the global premium going through the system. You're widely used by many of the larger organizations. So, in your role as the chairman of Guidewire now, how do you make sure how do they make sure they don't now become the legacy system and the incumbent that people are challenged by? Because how do you stay agile basically for a company now that's that size?
It's something that the company frets about all the time, as it should. It's easy to get complacent. There's a kind of trade on the entrepreneurial journey. You have, maximum freedom in the early days, even though you have no assets, and then you end up accruing quite a few assets if you succeed. But then you lose that freedom, and you're bound to your past promises, and including to decisions that you maybe would make differently today. And Guidewire is very firmly, deep into the kind of mature category. It's a 23-year-old company. It's $1 billion roughly in revenue, hundreds of customers, et cetera. It's gone through, many iterations of refreshes, architectural upgrades, to its core platform. And most importantly, we made a transformation as a company from an on-premise IT-centric, highly configurable, but kind of IT managed asset into now a cloud-based core platform. Not all of Guidewire's customers have made that migration, but it's essentially an inevitability. We've proven that it works. And it's more than half of the company's revenue now, and is sure to be the dominant preponderance. And that was an immensely difficult thing to do. It took several years, and it's not quite done, but we've certainly broken the back of the problem. That has to continue to happen. It's a time of extraordinary inventiveness and technological foment right now that's relevant to P&C. And I know that you wanted to talk about this too, Matthew. Essentially every single insurance process is, I think, ripe to be reconsidered, almost from, not quite from first principles, but something close to it, in saying, how does this look different in an era where at least certain low-level kinds of judgments can be made much more efficiently and just as accurately by a machine as a human, and many other changes. And I think, Guidewire is in a position to be extremely relevant towards, as relevant as ever, but it has to take seriously that whatever the many of the premises from the past, no longer apply to the same degree in the present.
Well, that's actually a good link to your role today at Battery Ventures. We talked a bit about what motivated you to go off and build Guidewire. It seems to me a very different motivation to go and support an organization making investments in other companies. What is it that now gets you up? And I know you get up early in the morning because you've spoken to me early in the morning. You run a Battery.
The quick advertisement is Battery is, a multi-stage technology investment firm. It's been around 40 years. It's invested about $13 billion or so over the years, primarily in software, now investing out of its 14th fund. I joined Battery, the full investment team. I contemplated joining an assortment of different venture firms, including Battery, in a kind of operational advisor capacity. And for whatever reason, decided I want to do the real job. If I'm going to, I want to do it to the hilt. And that means being a full investor. And that's learning a new competency. You can be an entrepreneur for decades, and there's still a lot to learn. Even having raised multiple rounds of venture capital and talked to countless entrepreneurs, there's a lot to learn about how to be a thoughtful and skilled investor. And as they say in the VC industry, it takes a decade to know if you're any good at it. And so I'm nowhere close to that. I'm approaching 2 years in this role, and we'll see. It's a very, very different kind of persona. It's a very different kind of mentality. It's a portfolio view as opposed to being single-threaded through, one company whose success is, an existential matter every day. It's a bit more cerebral in certain ways. It's more analytical. It has the joy of learning about lots of new domains continuously and meeting an unending stream of fascinating entrepreneurs. But it does not offer the very characteristic rewards of deep ownership and accountability and building something that didn't exist before. And I miss that. I miss it a great deal. What drew me to it was ultimately entrepreneurs. I find it immensely gratifying to spend time with entrepreneurs. I'd say a good portion of them are crazy, and that's okay because I share in some of that craziness. But they are the most passionate people that I know. There's a kind of eternal youth, that comes from interacting with them and their, relentless optimism, however well it may be founded. And that was happening for me, of course. From when Guidewire went public, there was plenty of opportunities to talk to peers, but I was obsessed with running my own company. Qualitatively different now, being an investor where I attach to a world-class platform like Battery, where every day is getting to meet additional ones, and I find a kind of reward there that that I really prize.
And one of your investments you mentioned is Exponential. We've been following Amber and his colleagues since he has left Tokyo Marine. Really interesting background for those that don't know. There's a full podcast, but programmer, then actuary, then founder, building a pricing platform. I'm not using hyperbole here. We virtually every day we hear about somebody that is working with them or connecting to them. So I can understand at my level to some extent, but what did you see in what Hyper and Exponential are doing that led to the investment from Battery and Andreessen Horowitz?
Both in my capacity with Guidewire and then as an investor at Battery, it's just very natural for InsureTech entrepreneurs to I'm usually 1 degree of separation at most, what feels like all of them. And so over the last few years, even before joining Battery, I was meeting them constantly. And I'd estimate I've met probably upwards of 150 or more, maybe 200 of them over the last number of years. I can confidently say that Hyper Exponential is, if not the most, one of the top 2 or 3 most compelling InsureTechs I've met in that entire time. So that tells most of the story. Why is that the case? It's because they have met the market at precisely the right moment with precisely the right product, devised by individuals who came from the domain and also not just came from it and had a sense of this opportunity, but passionately believed that this kind of platform needed to exist and would make a material difference in both the efficacy, but also the professional fulfillment of the people who would use it. It's a highly specialized, high priesthood of people who do, actuaries and insurers, especially the ones that they serve first in the kind of large commercial specialty syndicate business, but generally speaking, the actuarial profession. And it's a highly technical domain that I don't think even the brightest people outside the industry could have really conceived and built the right product for, but they did. And they achieved a level of initial commercial traction that, while not unprecedented, is an outlier, is really striking. And then finally, they did it very efficiently. I mean, with an astonishingly little amount of capital, just through grit and the hard work of the founders, of course, and the early team, but also, again, because they just met the market with precisely the right product at the right moment in time. So that's, of course, the magical thing that you're looking for as an investor. To have done so in an industry that I love and have served for decades was fantastic. And even more so because it's a part of the P&C industry that Guidewire, at least historically, has not touched. Guidewire does not really serve the actuary, or has not historically. And as much time as I spent in insurers, and I visited hundreds, I don't think you'll meet many people who have been in more insurance company headquarters than I. The very relatively few actuaries. And so it's been a very meaningful learning experience to work with HX, and again, a remarkable company.
Yeah, I like that term, the high priesthood of actuaries. And another thing that struck me about them is this is going to be a generalization, but there's a slight difference. I think the European style of building a business, I think a little bit like the way you did it, which is you go out, you build a business, you sort of bootstrap it, get customers, get revenue, puts you in a much stronger position when you come out to look to raise revenue for all the reasons that we know. But I think that was quite impressive as well. And then just, Marcus, more broadly around this. So InsureTech as a term has been out almost 10 years now. As Rob and I were sort of reflecting a little bit of where the world is and what we're seeing, and you've touched on this a little bit, there's a sort of concept which we're starting to hear described, we know some described as like risk operations or risk ops, which is a sort of subset, and it's probably more relevant for specialty business, but maybe not. I'm just quite intrigued. And this is a little bit Hyper Exponential as part of this, but there's organizations that are dealing with moving data around, creating efficiencies. Do you also see that kind of subset of what's happening, and it's a little bit of the splitting off of what was InsureTech into subcategories, so some of which are relevant and some of which are no longer important?
2 broad themes I can speak to. One, it's a very natural course of all software to kind of hive off into many subdomains that were at one point considered just a feature set or a small fraction of a larger core system that then become their own domain in their own right. I mean, indeed, you could think of a claim system as that. The initial claim systems were just a subsystem of a policy system. It was an attribute of a policy that you happen to have a claim on it. But now, of course, there's its own characteristic workflows and data and supply chain that really require an entirely different kind of core system domain to sustain a core system. And we're seeing that happen, in the in this kind of formally unsystematized zone between the presentation of a risk and then the evaluation of that risk, the proper pricing of it, and then binding a policy to it, especially in some of the more complex lines of insurance. And there's a broad and kind of obvious recognition that that is its own system domain. It's not just part of the policy system, right? It's its own domain. On top of that, though, the other big theme I'd say is that, as we know in just about every other, in our daily lives, as well as in any category of enterprise software, the management of data, of very large data sets, often coming in very different kinds of modalities and sources, being able to organize that, synthesize it, and extract signal from it is not just an incidental, nice to have analytical exercise you do after the fact. It's become absolutely instrumental to the operations of almost any business, let alone insurance, where of course the whole principle is that you are making predictions about the future, in high volume based on signals that you have both about the present and the past. So it's entirely natural, entirely healthy, and very exciting that you would have this other domain. Whether you want to put it under InsureTech is immaterial. I think, that term didn't even exist when Guidewire was founded, or not, but that really seeks to address the unique data management, data analytical challenges that are specific to insurance. And Exponential is absolutely one of those examples, but not the only one. And I think there's lots of room for other players, other innovation.
So Marcus, quick time check. So we've got 7 minutes. Is there anything that you want to talk about to make sure we do include it before we wrap up?
The fact that Exponential is a British company, that has a kind of personal valence for me because I have profound affection for the UK. I nearly settled there as a citizen, but for a few personal factors that brought me back to the States. I was very at home there. And I think, especially for insurance, it's very logical that there would be, a flourishing technology ecosystem, and battery is certainly paying close attention. And I think that there will be, insurance or otherwise, there'll be many other startups that will receive institutional funding for both British and US insurers to come. And it has been fun to be part of one of the leaders in that this year.
Great. Well, as I said, a shot in the arm for the UK, and also the benefit, of course, about London is all that specialty insurance is very close together. You can cover a lot of ground. One thing, Marcus, I do want to cover is I had a coffee with Nigel Walsh from Google Cloud yesterday. I think you do know him. He had a question, and I actually whipped out my phone and got him to record the question for you. And so this is what he asked.
The question is that I get asked by carriers all the time: what does the future of the admin system look like? We often get approached and say, given the advancements in data capabilities and technologies that we and others have brought to bear, generative AI specifically right now, and so much more, do we even need an admin system? I think for large-scale carriers where you're migrating out of a large-scale legacy platform or otherwise, it makes total sense. And questions don't come from those folks. It's more the tier 2 or tier 3 providers that have a more innovative and agile way of engaging. Would love your perspective. Thanks.
It's been a while since Nigel and I interacted, but I think only highly of him, and we collaborated when we had different roles in Guidewire's earlier days. I think his question's a thoughtful one. I have two big thoughts. One is that, let's say on the affirmative side, I think generative AI, magical technology, there's open questions about whether its capabilities have been overstated and how long some of the bigger claims about it, will come to pass. But there is no question that the kind of core, undeniable kind of like search and summarizing, especially out of unstructured information that Gen AI provides, is very useful, in that insurance in particular affords a wealth of use cases where that capability can be really constructively applied. And so I think that is only common sense that every insurance process, new business submission to claims administration, to policyholder service, to ceded reinsurance management, every insurance process will benefit from being able to better corral this unruly mess of data that which often comes in unstructured, non-standardized, synthesize it, extract at least high-level summarization and understanding of that empower the insurance knowledge worker to make more efficient decisions. That's abundantly clear. That takes no risk to predict that. It's a bit riskier to predict whether or not that will happen in the form of new entrants or capabilities that will be extensions of what incumbent solutions already do. And I think there's a battleground there where the winners are anything but clear. That's one big thematic opinion. The other thematic opinion I have, though, is a bit more cautionary. And that is, there have been different times in my own career, in insurance software specifically, where people have heralded the kind of death of core systems, where they have said, we don't need these big monolithic systems. They're challenging to manage, expensive to implement and upgrade, et cetera, et cetera. Really what we want is a kind of basket of services, an ability to, we want to decompose all of that and etherealize it and make it much easier just to kind of get the information you want at the moment you want it. And there's no need to have a big piece of software as such. And that, I think, is a false theory. I don't think that actually works. And so I think there's tempting to say, well, given these seemingly magical capabilities of Gen AI, maybe we can kind of euthanize the policy admin system because, we can just, have the data in a giant Snowflake instance and just ask it questions and get everything that we need. It's more time than we have right now, Matthew, but I think that's to the extent anyone is saying it, and I'm not saying Nigel is, but it is a kind of tempting extension of this kind of line of reasoning. I don't think anything like that will happen. And I think that, especially when you're talking about transactional systems of record, especially in a regulated industry, but even if it weren't, you need a certain kind of coherence and completion of a system domain that has to be thought of by one design mind. And, it has to be tested, has to be deterministic, has to have all these other attributes that I think Gen AI is not well situated to displace, but, rather to augment.
Yeah, I completely agree. From the world of catastrophe modeling that I was in, where people would think you could bring together different model components, and you need to look at it all as an integrated whole. Well, Marcus, you've been very generous with your time, and to you personally, also all your colleagues at Guidewire, John Mullen, Charles Clark, Mark Phillips, and all the others who've been supporting us over in the UK and in the US. And I'd love at some point to have a chance to talk to you on stage, either in the UK or in the US. But thank you for everything, and thank you to Paul Mang as well, one of your former colleagues who reintroduced us and hopefully gave you some encouragement to join. So thank you, and I'll let you get on with your day, which is just beginning. Wow. Well, what can I add to that? Now, whether you're starting a business, growing one, working with one, or investing in one, I'm sure you can't help but be inspired by Marcus, surely. Now, if you want to hear more about what Hyper Exponential are up to, then you can find my interview with Amrit Santhosan on episode 263 from September last year, or get a more recent update if you go to the InsureTech YouTube channel from our event in New York earlier this year. And if you need help yourselves, well, you can find out what we're up to at www.insuretech.co, or you can contact me, Matthew Grant, or Robin Mertens on LinkedIn. That's it. We're done. You can get back to the beach now.